Planet Earth is the most crazy place and the most beautiful place, a place that we the human race calls home. But this Earth would be so much easier to live on if our global leaders and the wealthy elite would honour their office or their responsibilities with the truth, especially the Fourth Estate. The media, whose responsibility is to report an unbiased truth, have always favoured political agendas since Adam was a cowboy. And in 1787, Edmund Burke, an Irish statesman and philosopher, said there were 3 estates in Parliament. But in the reporters' gallery yonder, there sat a 4th estate, more important far than they all. Later, Oscar Wilde wrote, "In the old days men had the rack, now they have the press. That is an improvement certainly, but still it is very bad and wrong and demoralising." Somebody, was it Burke, called journalism the 4th estate. That was true at the time, no doubt. But at the present moment it is the only estate. It has eaten up the other 3. The Lord's temporal say nothing. The Lord's spiritual have nothing to say. And the House of Commons has nothing to say and says it. We are dominated by journalism. These words demonstrate the accuracy of that phrase, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And by dint of their own circumstances, the media has therefore the important responsibility of impartial truth bestowed them. None of what you are about to see and hear would be happening now if the 4th estate did their job properly and upheld the creed of journalism. My name is Dave Kearney and I am one of millions of concerned citizens of planet Earth. My concern is on many levels, but this film will focus on global warming. Or is it climate change, or climate disruption, or climate weirding? Perhaps to be more accurate, climate very to little no warming, which is otherwise completely normal anyway. As citizens of the Earth, we have all been born into it with a natural code of ethics, a set of unwritten moral laws that say we are responsible for our own behaviour, that we must treat others well and do our best in times of need for those in need. We must not steal, we must not take the lives of others, and among many other laws subtly lying beneath them all is that inherent obligation to look after our environment, and in the great scheme of things, the Earth as well. But unfortunately, those responsibilities have become a little clouded for some of us, whereby an honest integrity in the pursuit of global hygiene has been cast aside for the mighty dollar. Unfortunately, with climate change, political agendas have hyped a non-existent problem through an unspoken coercion via the promise of significant research grants, the continuance of which requires towing the political line, coupled with the peer pressure within the scientific community, which is all then supported by a huge media bias. I have lost count of the many New Zealanders who are aware of the issues and who have replied to me, "Oh, it's just political bullshit," when I ask them where they stand on climate change. But there remains an apathetic, helpless disconnect, as though perhaps it doesn't matter. After all, none of the predictions about sea level rises and major droughts are really happening anyway. Well, this film is also dedicated to those who are unaware of the issues, but who are just blissfully and perhaps unwittingly accepting of what comes over the news each night. To them, we will show the flaws in the climate change argument and the bad science from which the politicians are making decisions. We will also expose the many lies put forward by the scientists and the meteorological services around the world who have falsified data to support their climate change theory. This film does, however, present a one-sided view, but likewise the same as all that comes through the mainstream media in support for climate change. However, ultimately, the aim will be to help the unenlightened make informed decisions. So please watch this film in its entirety and learn what the media won't tell you. And please take the time to like it if you do. God bless Mother Nature and take care all.
The biggest con in human history is happening right now, right under the noses of the world's population. And 70% of us, or maybe more, are sucked in or ignoring it. The scam of global warming or climate change has been subtly but continuously and almost subliminally levelled at us by those apparent trustworthy scientists who have a godlike faith bestowed upon them by the unknowing masses. Politicians, especially in America, are pushing their chicken little story hard like a greedy drug dealer trying to hook the unwary into a lifetime of carbon taxes.
2014 was the planet's warmest year on record. And the best scientists in the world are all telling us that our activities are changing the climate. And if we don't act forcefully, we'll continue to see rising oceans, longer, hotter heat waves, dangerous droughts and floods, and massive disruptions that can trigger greater migration and conflict and hunger around the globe. The Pentagon says that climate change poses immediate risks to our national security.
They have taken advantage of the current rising levels of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere and promoting it as a serious environmental disaster. That the increased levels of CO2 is creating a greenhouse environment, which in turn is causing global temperatures to rise at apparently alarming rates. But worse, also claiming that it is anthropogenic, that is, caused by us, the human race. To meet their political desires, they, and in particular the likes of Al Gore, are selling their fake science with the use of alarmist tactics, stating as fact that global destruction is imminent, with the planet burning up unless we reduce our carbon footprint. These alarmists claim that rising temperatures are causing drought, rising sea levels, melting glaciers and ice caps, increasingly more severe weather events, along with the depletion of some animal species, in particular those fluffy, cute polar bears. But further, and disingenuously, they are also playing on our heartstrings by asking us to believe that we are leaving the world in a rotten state for our grandchildren to clean up or perish in.
And reduce carbon pollution. If we do nothing to keep glaciers from melting faster and oceans from rising faster and forests from burning faster and storms from growing stronger, we will condemn our children to a planet beyond their capacity to repair.
Even worse is that most of the main media outlets repeat the rhetoric of politicians and government-paid scientists and do not fairly and impartially report both sides of the debate. Credible scientists with dissenting views are often branded as being fringe science deniers, a slur with connotations alluding to the Holocaust. Some far-right warming alarmists have even suggested that anyone who challenges the mainstream views on the so-called settled science of global warming should be imprisoned. But how did it all come to this? Why is there so much heated debate? Why is it so controversial? And why is it so divisive? And how did it all start? This film seeks to answer all those questions and more, with the object of highlighting many of the issues that are being ignored by mainstream media. How it all started in a tiny nutshell. In the early 1970s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was having difficulty with striking coal miners who had become a major thorn in her backside, especially since the country depended so much on coal, and alternatively, she did not like dealing with the Arabs for oil. To her, nuclear power was the answer, but it would be a hard sell with its associated waste problem and the link between anything nuclear and mass destruction. When global warming was first mooted, it was music to her ears. Thatcher realised she could use the idea to her advantage. So, while also promoting nuclear power, part of the tactic was to make carbon-based fuels environmentally unfriendly.
Margaret Thatcher became the first world leader to warn about the dangers of global warming.
The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. We've proposed a global convention, a sort of good conduct guide to the environment for all the world's nations on problems like the greenhouse effect.
At the time, the idea that the world was warming through human emissions of CO2 was in its infancy and not regarded at all by mainstream science because they were all actually worried about global cooling, despite the fact that temperatures were beginning to rise.
In 1977, the worst winter in a century struck the United States. Arctic cold gripped the Midwest for weeks on end. Great blizzards paralyzed cities of the Northeast. One desperate night in Buffalo, 8 people froze to death in marooned cars. Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way. According to recent evidence, it could come sooner than anyone had expected. At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age.
The climate science enforcement agencies tend now to play down the strong emphasis and consensus attributed to cooling at the time as though it was just a flirtation with ideas that didn't really pan out anyway. But there was a strong consensus towards cooling, which obviously turned out to be totally false. To strengthen her argument, Thatcher approached the scientific community with offers of money to prove the CO2 case, and it was at this point climate science became political. As a result, and in exchange for the vast amounts of money granted for research, the answers had to be what the politicians wanted to hear. Almost immediately, because of the esteemed faith placed in scientists, environmental groups got on board and pushed their barrow for them. Soon after, the big financiers of America realized that all this presented a money-making opportunity through carbon taxes, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. The IPCC, whose terms of reference was primarily only to scientifically prove anthropogenic human-caused warming, and while they may consider natural causes, any evidential weight attributed to that is low. From here, the IPCC politicians and their sycophantic scientists set about tackling the problem of global warming through summits attended by delegates from most countries. One of the first was in Kyoto, Japan, and from it came the Kyoto Protocol, which was a non-binding international treaty committing participant countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions based on scientific evidence that global warming was occurring and that it was highly likely human emissions of CO2 was the cause. The treaty promoted an emissions tax on CO2 and other minor greenhouse gases where reductions could be achieved through the incentive of a financial penalty for no reductions. Realizing there were big dollars to be made from global warming, the plot got further thickened when Al Gore came along with travelling speeches and his Academy Award-winning movie, An Inconvenient Truth. This award was clearly a jack-up, but with its now heightened status, the movie could reach a far larger audience more effectively, which introduced the current disingenuous fear factor of global warming along with a bunch of other ridiculous predictions which never came true.
As a result, the Earth has a fever, and the fever is rising. The experts have told us it is not a passing affliction that will heal by itself. We asked for a second opinion, and a third, and a fourth. And the consistent conclusion, restated with increasing distress, is that something basic is wrong. We are what is wrong, and we must make it right. Last September 21st, as the northern hemisphere tilted away from the sun, scientists reported with unprecedented alarm that the North Polar ice cap is, in their words, falling off a cliff. One study estimated that it could be completely gone during summer in less than 22 years. Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now.
There is possibly, however, a more sinister cause for the spread of this warming alarmism through the world via the Veiled Club of Rome. This organisation is closely aligned with the United Nations and its very scary Agenda 21 doctrine. It is connected with big money and has many influential members. According to Wikipedia, quote, "The Club of Rome consists of current and former heads of state, UN bureaucrats, high-level politicians and government officials, diplomats, scientists, economists, and business leaders from around the globe."
The Club of Rome, for most of you, I guess, is rather well known. For those who don't know about us, we are a global think tank that was established some 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, we had our 50th anniversary a couple of months ago in Rome. And that's when we decided to develop this, what we call climate emergency plan. Decades of exponential growth in both population and consumption is now hitting what we would call the limits of the global biosphere. The climate is, as we know, destabilizing. Soil erosion has been rampant over the last 100 years. We have lost around half of the topsoil on Earth. Nearly 90% of fish stocks are either overfished or fished to their maximum capacity. We have also seen about half of the tropical forests being gone over the last 50 to 100 years. And there was an alarming report from WWF International the other day telling us that we, humans, we have, through our actions, eliminated 60% of the land-based wild vertebrates since 1970. We used to talk about climate change as something in the future, but it's with us now. Quite surely this cannot go on. The recent IPCC report sent a stark reminder to all of us about what we would call the existential threat posed by climate change. And to avoid worst outcomes, global emissions must be cut by half to 2030 and go down to close to zero in 2050. And this, my friends, is a daunting task. It means around 7% of reduction per annum, year after year after year, at the global level.
Hence, the Club of Rome's main goals would be achieved by creating a global crisis, one in which the whole world would need one world governance in order to save the planet. This one world government is commonly referred to as the New World Order. To many this will sound crazy, but be that as it may, it is clearly stated in a book by Alexander King entitled The First Global Revolution, a report by the Council of the Club of Rome on page 75, that the crisis will be global warming. That mantra now predominantly referred to as climate change, quote, "In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. In their totality, and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat, which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap which we have already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself." Unquote. Many may think that this idea of a new world order comes directly from the overactive minds of the tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy nut brigade, but no, politicians have been subtly introducing it to the populace for some time.
And the hope that each of us has to build a new world order.
There's a need for a new world order. When really a new world order can be created, it's a great opportunity. It isn't just a crisis.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order, and instead it looks like we got a lot of disorder. And we still, and after 9/11, we've been more sensitive.
Out of it came a new Europe, a new world order, a new consensus as to how life should and could be lived.
Never before has a new world order had to be assembled from so many different perceptions or on so global a scale.
Is to actually create a new world order.
2009 is also the first year of global governance, with the establishment of the G20 in the middle of the financial crisis. The climate conference in Copenhagen is another step towards the global management of our planet.
Leaders come together and establish a framework for global governance.
We have resolved that from today we will together manage the process of globalization to secure responsibility from all and fairness to all. And we've agreed that in doing so, we will build a more sustainable and more open and a fairer global society.
In 1990, another old world ended, dominated by the Cold War, and people talked then, in 1990, of a new world order.
What that means is we've got to invest in countries that have no educational infrastructure, have no means for young people to get ahead. We've got to give them a stake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
And here, even indoctrinating children. In the cartoon movie Barnyard, this statement is completely out of context.
A toast to a new world order. We are calling the shots now. Nothing can touch us.
So in order to achieve this new world order, the United Nations and its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change must convince the world that the planet is dangerously warming and that we, the human race, is causing it. But is the climate actually warming? The short answer is yes, but this is dependent on what time frame is used to gauge a trend. There was a significant cooling trend from 65 million years ago to now, but more recently the unadjusted data shows that the world has warmed during the last 300 years to present, as we have emerged from the Little Ice Age of the 1700s. It has also warmed between 1915 to 1945, with the 30s being the hottest decade, even hotter than present. Then there was a period of cooling between 1945 to 1977. From 1979, when satellite records began, there was a warming period of less than 1 degree Celsius to 1998. And from the El Niño that year, there has been little to no warming since. This shows otherwise normal natural climate fluctuations. This graph from 1900 to 2010 shows global temperature anomalies, as in degrees above and below the current global mean, composed of 450 instrumental records from temperature stations sheltered from ocean air, urbanization, artificial adjustment biases throughout the world, which very closely aligns with paleoclimate evidence from tree rings, ice cores, fossil pollen, and other temperature proxies. The trends show perhaps a slight warming from 1900, a cooling from 1920, and a definite warming from 1960, but overall perhaps a seesawing that is relatively even. Not only were the 1930s the hottest decade in recent times, there have also been long periods in the past where temperatures have been much higher than today, times when the wheel nut on an SUV had not even been thought of yet. In fact, the 1930s was a time of extreme temperatures known as the Dust Bowl in America, where the burgeoning use of fossil fuels had not begun. CO2 levels at this time had actually plateaued. It must be remembered that any data on global temperatures before about 150 years ago is an estimate, a reconstruction based on proxies such as ice cores, lake sediment, and tree ring data, etc. But this does give a good indication of climate, as most of the different methods, proxies, which have been collated from many parts of the world, basically follow the same trends.
First are those layers I mentioned in the New Zealand snow. They've turned to ice and we can count them. Summer, winter, like tree rings, we can date the core. Other cores tell other stories. Look at this. It's the ash of an Icelandic volcano that blew up to Greenland 50,000 years ago.
They're able to measure very precisely levels of carbon dioxide in that ancient air.
Looking at the cores, we see a pattern that repeats. 280 parts per million of CO2, then 180, 280, 180, 280.
By analyzing the chemistry of the oxygen atoms in the ice, you can also see the pattern of rising and falling temperature over time. Colder during the ice ages, warmer during the interglacial period.
In New Zealand, NIWA's own unadjusted figures also follow those same global trends, with no warming from 1998. Further, this graph from Climate Conversation in an article by Barry Brill shows the instrumental temperature records taken for New Zealand since the early 1990s. Suspiciously, NIWA have adjusted down the historical record as if to show a warming trend more dramatic and to be in line with IPCC global trends and those of the models. And this for Wellington from NASA. The unadjusted downward trend is explained away by the use of temperature readings taken at different heights and locations in Wellington over a long period. The adjusted version, presumably to allow for this, conveniently shows a warming trend from 1940. So the question has to be asked: would the differing locations and altitudes allowed for create such an appreciable difference? And why are the adjustments always conveniently more warmer recently and cooler in the past? Also, NIWA's own figures for New Zealand from the 7 Stations series show there has been little or no warming in the last 20 years, shown here as degrees above and below the mean, although the cooler temperatures between 1910 and 1940 are once again suspicious. Indeed, very suspicious, especially when the same data is replotted without the adjustments as seen here. The continuous warming trend is gone, and apart from the El Niño of the late 90s, the present temperature sits only on the higher side of normal. The same can be seen globally, as shown here by this graph from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, with data from remote sensing systems transmitted from weather satellites. Satellite systems are regarded as the most accurate method available for gathering temperature data because of their complete global coverage, as opposed to data gathered by surface temperature instruments, which cover only about 30% of the globe. This period between 1998 and 2018, known as the pause or the warming hiatus, has been very inconvenient for scientific pro-warmers, but as always, they have come up with a myriad of different excuses to explain away their problem. But the figures speak for themselves. The world is not warming at the moment, and has not done so for the last 20 years, which is also at odds with predictions from IPCC models. This 20-year period is not cherry-picked, as the IPCC has identified the hiatus in warming trends and have defined the period as commencing with the 1998 giant El Niño in their fifth assessment report, AR5. Again, simply put, there has been no warming since 1998. After only 5 years into the hiatus, many of the scientific warmist collaborators were becoming concerned, and as evident from the Climate Gate emails, had discussed this inconvenience between themselves. From that, it seems an agreed arbitrarily set period of 15 years must lapse before any trend can be recognized. Probably because none of them thought the temperatures would continue to flatline for so long. Now that the 15 years has come and gone, many of them have moved the goalposts yet again and are now extending it to 20 years, which has also come and gone with no appreciable warming. During this hiatus, and after coming up with no less than 66 different excuses for the pause and being proven wrong with all of them, those respected alarmist climate scientists finally threw their hands in the air and simply denied there was a pause at all and released a new readjusted data set showing an increase in temperatures from 1998 through to 2017. Interestingly though, that increase does not even come up to the minimum projected temperatures by the IPCC models, which can be seen here. And yet this faulty data still made its way into the hands of politicians who make decisions on tax money for climate research and carbon taxes. Meteorological services throughout the world insist on using primarily instrumental surface temperature data rather than the more reliable and accurate satellite data, which boasts global coverage, probably because that data does not fit their warming theory and is likely less easier to fudge. However, adjustments to the raw surface temperature data are required to account for anomalies such as instrument changes, stationary locations, urban heat island biases, and changes of observation times, to name a few. But once again, it is suspicious that in all cases the past temperatures are adjusted down while recent and current temperatures are adjusted up, which inevitably shows a more pronounced warming trend. This blink comparator shows changes in the US temperature record from NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. It alternates between their 1999 graph and the 2012 version from the same data. The past is cooled and the present is warmed. And this graph with historical overlapping adjusted data from NASA shows an obvious intent to portray an over-exaggerated warming from 1981 to the red line being 2015. Further supporting the warmist's fraudulent lies is this peer-review study by scientists which explains that almost of all the warming comes from the adjustments to the global average surface temperature. In this research, the most important surface data adjustment issues are identified and past changes in the previously reported historical data are quantified. It was found that each new version of global average surface temperature has nearly always exhibited a steeper warming linear trend over its entire history. And it was nearly always accomplished by systematically removing the previously existing cyclical temperature pattern. This was true for all three entities providing global average surface temperature data adjustments: NOAA, NASA, and Hadley Crew. It is hard to understand how many cannot see through this fraudulent tampering of the data. The lies are blatant and obvious. Do rising CO2 levels drive temperature? Just like the word conspiracy now means loon, crank or nutburrism, especially in conjunction with 9/11, the words carbon dioxide have become dirty words too for those advocates of a warming globe. The fact is that CO2 is essential to life on Earth, though it only makes up a small proportion of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Since the onslaught of climate alarmism, many commentators describe this gas as a poison that should be drastically reduced, when in fact higher levels could only be an advantage, in particular to those deforested areas of the globe. Once again, the role of CO2 has been highly misrepresented by the scientific community and the media. The following graph was on the ABC's news website, which completely distorts the concentration of greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere and the amount of CO2 it contains, making the concentration of it seem much larger than it is. Carbon dioxide makes up only 4% of the total of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. The author of this graph has left out the most abundant greenhouse gas, water vapor, which makes up 95% of greenhouse gases as seen here. Water vapor is the most potent of all greenhouse gases, which can trap heat much more efficiently than all the others put together. Water vapor, while not a gas by definition, is regarded as a greenhouse gas and is responsible for 60 to 70% of any warming. In turn, all greenhouse gases make up only 2 to 4% of the total of Earth's atmosphere. This chart represents the entire global atmosphere and shows a more accurate perspective. CO2 is approximately 0.04% of the total atmospheric gases, which is minuscule in the big picture, and it's hard to imagine it could have any effect on anything. Basically, one could trap more heat with a fart than could the present levels of CO2.
Carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, first of all, is a trace element, a trace gas. It's about, if you look at a football stadium with 100,000 people in it, each person representing a molecule of the atmosphere, I think carbon dioxide would be about 35 or 36 people. And the human contribution to that may be that little guy with the red hat down there in row 3. I mean, it's minuscule. And even if we double the carbon dioxide, then we got 2 little guys in red hats among 100,000 people. So, I just feel that we're being arrogant in the fact that we are, controlling the climate.
Another misconception lauded by collaborator scientists, the media and Gore is that CO2 causes temperature to rise, when in fact the opposite is true. There is definite correlation between the two, but in most cases temperature rises precede CO2. Significant rises in CO2 sometimes lag behind temperature rises from as much as between 200 to 1,000 years, and on occasions CO2 levels have actually dropped while temperatures rise. This graph shows the correlation between CO2 and temperature, plotted with data from Vostok ice cores over the last 50,000 years. It can be clearly seen that in most cases, the temperature has risen first, followed by CO2. The reason for this is that the oceans, being so vast, take so long to warm up, where they begin to release CO2 that has been held while they are colder. Clearly, in most cases, temperature drives CO2 levels. This schematic graph by Monte Hayeb, taken from the data of Christopher Scotese, geologist, further shows the correlation of CO2 and temperature going back 600 million years. While it is only a hand-drawn schematic, it still shows that CO2 does not cause the temperature to rise. In fact, during the Ordovician Ice Age, CO2 is over 4,000 parts per million, 10 times higher than it is today. There was no industrial revolution or burgeoning motor industry then. In the Cretaceous period, the temperature went up while CO2 continued to decrease to present. This historical CO2 graph, which comes from the IPCC and NOAA, which they have since readjusted, seems to mirror and reinforce Monte Hayeb's schematic quite well. But as global temperatures have not increased over the past 20 years and has rather naturally seesawed up and down on a constant mean, CO2 has risen, albeit not anywhere near previous levels in Earth's distant past. The Mesozoic, among many periods, was a time when CO2 levels were nearly 8 times the levels of today, yet the temperatures exponentially dropped. So clearly, it is safe to say that CO2 does not cause temperature to rise. There are many commentators who advocate that any rise in CO2, which is an essential ingredient of all life on Earth, could be good for the planet and would help deforested areas regenerate, it would grow food quicker, which in turn draws in more CO2 and exponentially releases more oxygen. While there is no doubt humans are releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere, it is not enough to cause such an increase as present. These changes can only be mainly through natural causes, such as oceanic temperature via solar variations. After all, the oceans are the biggest emitter of CO2, and by comparison human emissions are minuscule at somewhere around 4% of all CO2 in the atmosphere. But the debate over human and natural emissions is unsettled, as the scenario for natural emissions is explained away by global warming scientists through the carbon flux process, which simply means that natural emissions are reabsorbed by the Earth to maintain a natural balance. So therefore, the extra human emissions are saturating the system, which is causing the apparent greenhouse effect and in turn causing temperatures to rise. But of course, at present, not causing temperatures to rise. To put this in perspective, the levels of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere have varied between 200 and 300 parts per million over the last million years or more. But since the burgeoning global industrial machine began to gather momentum from the 50s, the CO2 levels have also risen exponentially and now exceed 400 parts per million. This, of course, has been blamed by most on the human emissions from that continued and expanding industry, which is very convenient if the hypothesis is to prove CO2 is causing a problem. This graph from NASA shows CO2 levels over the past 400,000 years. It is unfortunate NASA didn't go back further, which would have shown just how minuscule today's levels really are. As previously seen, CO2 levels 150 million years ago were around 2,000 parts per million, much less than 4,000 parts per million 400 million years ago. There seems to be reasonable agreement between pro-warmists and skeptics that the total greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere are around 4%, and of that 4% total, carbon dioxide is 4%, and human CO2 contribution only is approximately 3.5%, which is an insanely small amount in the big picture. But it must be remembered, however, that all these so-called extra human emissions at one time originated from Earth's greater ever-changing system anyway. So, from whence it came, it was once and still is live animals and plants. Or it was trapped within dormant volcanoes and oil deposits and so on. Therefore, it is not necessarily extra. Although perhaps all that CO2 is not supposed to be in the atmosphere at once, it is clear that the Earth can cope with the extra returning, as it has done so many times in the past, through events that would far surpass human emissions, through warming oceans, volcanic eruptions, major forest fires, and perhaps even large meteor impacts. To suggest that humans could have any effect to such a large degree on our vast climate system from our unfortunate but minuscule emissions is an arrogance reaching the highest echelons of stupidity, as much as it is to suggest that we could have any positive effect by reducing them. Computer climate models and data gathering. A computer model is a mathematical way of predicting the future based on what has happened in the past, and is without doubt the way of the future for predicting weather, and maybe even seismic events or recreating catastrophic incidences. But to date, it is a well-known fact that the science is far from perfect, especially for predicting future climate, which is exceedingly complex. Computer models fail to predict accurately or even moderately accurately basic trends, with anything from 40 to 50% fail rate. In their fifth assessment report, the IPCC reported the predictions of 73 computer models, and they were all wrong, not just by a little, but by a lot.
I am one of the few people that actually builds these climate data sets from scratch so that we can see what the real climate is doing.
Well, I understand you may have a slide that compares the various climate models.
Yes, being from Alabama, a lot of target.
Would you explain that?
There. So this is a target. That is the trend in the atmospheric temperature that has happened since 1979. That's the target that you want to hit with your climate model. So it's like we give someone 102 bullets to shoot at that target. Okay, go to the next one. And that's what they got. That not a single one of these climate model projections was able to hit the target. That is the basis, though, on which the policy is being made, is on those climate models, not on the evidence before us.
Do you have another slide that shows a difference in what's projected and what's real? Or this is the one you were showing a while ago?
Yes, that I think everyone here in this room can understand that slide. And I think they would understand something is wrong with the scientific theory we have about how greenhouse gases affect the climate. No one has said this slide is wrong. It's been available for over 2 years, or over a year. It took me a long time to build it because that's downloading 102 models and so on. But that is the way I understand it. The extreme claims about climate change are based upon what those models, what that red line is showing, and not on what the real world is actually doing.
In the real world, the temperatures did not rise as much as the models predicted, and have not especially since 1998. According to an article in the New American and based just on the laws of probability, quote, a monkey rolling the dice would have done far better at predicting future temperatures than the UN's model. Most computer models, including those used by the IPCC, NASA and NOAA, and most meteorological agencies worldwide, gather temperature data to make their climate predictions from surface thermometers spread over a given area. These government-paid climatologists claim that this data is the best and most reliable, but there are a number of problems associated with this method, including altitude, proximity changes in the physical environment, reliance on inexpert volunteer data gathering, observation times, instrument changes, lack of rural, desert and ocean stations, the urban heat island effect for those thermometers used that are in built-up areas, and calculated guesses used in areas where there are no thermometers or where they have ceased to exist. The biggest, most obvious major problem with surface temperature data is that there are vast parts of the globe that do not have weather stations. The oceans and polar regions combined cover about 73% of the Earth's surface, as shown here, and of the remaining land area, only 30% is covered by actual thermometers. Interestingly, one of the reasons there has been a major decline in the number of weather stations globally is because of the increasing reliance on satellite data. That decline can be seen in this animation. The Mann Hockey Stick and ClimateGate. Michael Mann was the lead author of the chapter Observed Climate Variability and Change for the third IPCC assessment report that was published in 2001. It featured his infamous hockey stick graph, representing global temperatures spanning the last 1,000 years. To many independent scientists, Mann's graph was a questionable fabrication and little more than a temperature proxy trick concocted to validate government computer models. The graph caused a huge amount of controversy because of its major divergence from widely accepted previous graphs showing prominent warm periods and ice ages. The graph has, most conspicuously, completely erased the medieval warming period, the Little Ice Age, and the extreme heat of the 1930s, which far exceeded the temperatures of today. However, Mann's graph was uncritically accepted by the IPCC and warming enforcement agencies despite contradicting numerous previous studies, and so far he has refused to release his data for scrutiny to anyone other than those who already have a warming agenda. Peer reviews claimed to have been done were done only by IPCC scientists with the same politically coerced warming views. Still, many skeptics have called into question the methods he used to plot the hockey stick, where he deleted data that didn't conform and used more favourable instrumental data in place of the proxy data to create the desirable hockey stick shape that shows an alarming warning trend from about 1920. Mann denied he had done this. Mann's graph, covering the past 1,000 years, has used tree ring data up to the point where he grafted in favourable instrumental data that supported his hypothesis. This has attracted a huge storm of criticism from the scientific community and most notably from Canadian climatologist Dr. Tim Ball, who Mann is suing for apparent defamatory statements Ball made in public. After 8 years of legal zigzagging, Mann has refused to surrender the data he used to compile his now infamous graph, despite a court order. Anyone that has nothing to hide would do so. It should be publicly available anyway, since his research was funded with public taxes. Not to mention the fact that as part of the scientific method he needed to do so for the purposes of replication to give his research validity. As it turns out, in August 2019, the judge in a British Columbian court ruled against Mann as he had failed to produce the data he used to create the obviously fraudulent graph, which are clearly plotted lines from which politicians worldwide are to this day still making decisions for millions of dollars of publicly funded research grants and carbon taxes. Clearly, Mann was hiding something, because if his data stood up to scientific scrutiny, then surely he would have turned it over to the court. Doing so would have guaranteed a win. But he has elected to run with the lesser of the two bad options he had available, which were either release the data and be discovered as a liar, or preferably face the consequences of the court for refusing to release that data and continue to try and convince the world he is not lying. Similarly, with one of the leaked ClimateGate emails, the same arrogance is displayed by CRU lead climatologist Phil Jones with this email when denying a request for his data from Warwick Hughes, who not for the first time had emailed Jones requesting his data. On February the 21st, 2005, Jones replied, quote, "I should warn you that some data we have, we are not supposed to pass on to others. We can pass on the gridded data, which we do. Even if WMO agrees, I will still not pass on the data. We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" Unquote. Or if Jones was honest and more confident in his own data, perhaps he should have taken the view that Hughes might find that everything was in fact right with it. In November 2009, over 1,000 emails were hacked, or just as likely leaked by an insider, from the computer of Phil Jones, the head researcher of the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in England. Many of the emails revealed that leading government climate scientists around the world had been fraudulently manipulating climate data, denying official information requests for that data, collaborating to keep their research from climate skeptics, and also colluding to keep any opposing research papers out of the scientific literature, as they were part of the peer review process for such inclusion. The most notable email is one from Phil Jones to 5 colleagues, and is proof that mainstream climate researchers are conspiring to manipulate findings to show that humans are causing the globe to warm. Quote, "I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding the real temps to each series for the last 20 years, i.e. from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith's to hide the decline." Unquote. To break this text down, Mike refers to Michael Mann, lead author of the Hockey Stick Graph. Nature is a scientific journal that published the paper on which the hockey stick graph is based, where Mann had obviously used the trick, which refers, in this case, to replacing proxy data with real temps. The modern instrumental measurements, because that data was more favourable to the warming hypothesis. Keith refers to Keith Briffa, the Deputy Director of the CRU, the lead author of the chapter about proxies in the 2007 IPCC report, and his data over the same period. This graph shows the Briffa black line after the real temperatures were substituted from 1961 on. Jones sent the email after he had finished this graph, which is for the cover of the World Meteorological Organization report, WMO, Statement on the Status of the Global Climate. The graph would incorporate one reconstruction of his own plus one each from Michael Mann and Keith Briffa. These data sets were constructed from proxy data, which are temperature calculations taken from tree rings, ice cores and lake sediments, etc. But the original data seen here obviously did not convey the right message. In fact, the data was in direct conflict with the warming hypothesis. So, as a result of the email leak, the real data and resulting graph was released and clearly shows Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for Jones and Mann from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith's to hide the decline. Jones' substitution trick was not disclosed, and in doing so he committed scientific fraud. All participants in the scandal have, including Michael Mann, come out with weak excuses, exclaiming that the cherry-picked phrases have been taken out of context. But quite simply, the words were expressed, and no matter how much they squirm, twist or turn, context or no context, they can only mean what they say. James Corbett of the Corbett Report puts it all quite succinctly in brief.
This is James Corbett of ClimateGate.tv, and this week marks the one-year anniversary of the release of emails and documents from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia that we now know as ClimateGate. Sitting here now, 1 year later, it's becoming difficult to remember the importance of that release of information, or even what information was actually released. Many were only introduced to the scandal through commentary in the blogosphere, and many more came to know about it only weeks later, after the establishment media had a chance to assess the damage and fine-tune the spin that would help allay their audience's concern that something important had just happened. Very few have actually bothered to read the emails and documents for themselves. Few have browsed the Harry README file, the electronic notes of a harried programmer trying to make sense of the CRU's databases. They have never read for themselves how temperatures in the database were artificially adjusted to look closer to the real temperatures, or the hundreds, if not thousands, of dummy stations which somehow ended up in the database, or how the exasperated programmer resorts to expletives before admitting he made up key data on weather stations because it was impossible to tell what data was coming from what sources. Few have read the 2005 email from ClimateGate ringleader and CRU head Phil Jones to John Christie, where he states, quote, "The scientific community would come down on me in no uncertain terms if I said the world had cooled from 1998. Okay, it has, but it is only 7 years of data and it isn't statistically significant." Or where he concludes, "As you know, I'm not political. If anything, I would like to see the climate change happen so the science could be proved right, regardless of the consequences. This isn't being political, it is being selfish." Or the email where he broke the law by asking Michael Mann of hockey stick fame to delete a series of emails related to a Freedom of Information request he had just received. Or the email where he wrote, "If they ever hear there is a Freedom of Information Act now in the UK, I think I'll delete the file rather than send it to anyone. We also have a Data Protection Act, which I will hide behind." Or the other emails where these men of science say they will redefine the definition of peer review in order to keep differing viewpoints out of the scientific literature. Or where they discuss ousting a suspected skeptic from his editorial position in a key scientific journal. Or where they fret about how to hide the divergence in temperature proxy records from observed temperatures. Or where they openly discuss the complete lack of warming over the last decade. Or any of the thousands of other emails and documents exposing a laundry list of gross scientific and academic abuses. Of course, the alarmists continue to argue, as they have ever since they first began to acknowledge the scandal, that ClimateGate is insignificant. Without addressing any of the issues or the specific emails, they simply point to the independent investigations that they say have vindicated the ClimateGate scientists. Like the UK Parliamentary Committee, which issued a report claiming that Phil Jones and the CRU's scientific credibility remained intact after a rigorous one-day hearing which featured no testimony from any skeptic or dissenting voice. After the release of the report, the committee stressed that the report did not address all of the issues raised by ClimateGate, and Phil Willis, the committee chairman, admitted that the committee had rushed to put out a report before the British election. Or the Oxburgh Inquiry, chaired by Lord Ron Oxburgh, the UK Vice Chair of Globe International, an NGO-funded climate change legislation lobby group. The Oxburgh Inquiry released a 5-page report after having reviewed 11 scientific papers unrelated to the ClimateGate scandal that had been handpicked by Phil Jones himself. It heard no testimony or evidence from anyone critical of the CRU. Unsurprisingly, it found the ClimateGaters not guilty of academic misconduct. Regardless of what one thinks of the veracity or independence of these so-called investigations into the ClimateGate scandal itself, what has followed has been a catastrophic meltdown of the supposedly united front of scientific opinion that man-made CO2 is causing catastrophic global warming. In late November of 2009, just days after the initial release of the ClimateGate emails, the University of East Anglia was in the hot seat again. The CRU was forced to admit that they had thrown away most of the raw data that their global temperature calculations were based upon, meaning their work was not reproducible by any outside scientists.
There were 4 inquiries into the matter, all of which were not robust and lacked any proper and complete investigation, and for all 4 resulted in exoneration with not guilty verdicts for academic misconduct to all involved. They did, however, get a wrist slap for deceiving the public, and Phil Jones was found to have broken the law by the UK Information Commissioner for refusing to comply with Freedom of Information requests, but he could not be prosecuted because of a statute of limitations and time lapse, so he remains an unconvicted crook. As a result of this, and the actual fact that he did destroy emails that obviously contained evidence of his conspiratorial collaborations, and where he also encouraged his colleagues to do the same, how could anybody possibly believe a word they have said in their defense, let alone any of the bogus claims they are making about anthropogenic global warming? This email shows a deliberate attempt to hide data from public scrutiny. Quote, Mike is referring to Michael Mann. Mike, can you delete any emails you may have had with Keith, referring to Briffa re AR4. Keith will do likewise. Can you also email Gene, referring to Wal, and get him to do the same? I don't have his new email address. We will be getting Casper, referring to Aman, to do likewise. Cheers, Phil. Unquote. And this email from Jones to John Christie, which further confirms the desire to prove a prerequisite political hypothesis. Quote, as you know, I'm not political. If anything, I would like to see the climate change happen, so the science could be proved right, regardless of the consequences. This isn't being political, it is being selfish. Unquote. What happened to the scientific method here? It is clear that Phil Jones is a liar, and any excuse he makes over embarrassing emails can only be taken with the same dubious wariness any liar can be afforded. Interestingly, one of the emails to surface out of the ClimateGate scandal seems to suggest that CRU scientists and others are fully aware of the slight downward trend in global temperatures over the recent decade. Jones told one colleague in an email that, quote, bottom line, the no upward trend has to continue for a total of 15 years before we get worried, unquote. Not only that, this email supports what all skeptics know, that they have a theory and are determined to find evidence to support it. In other words, with the phrase, before we get worried, would mean that if the temperatures don't rise prior to a 15-year lapse, then he and his cohorts may have to admit they were wrong, or in reality, and worryingly, find it much harder to find evidence with which to explain away lack of warming. But of course, there has now been no warming for 20 years. So with the lack of any evidence to show any significant warming, the alarmists have changed their narrative to exaggerate more frequently occurring severe weather events to prove their claims. And according to them, this is all caused by the 0.04% concentration of CO2 in Earth's atmosphere, 3.4% of which is the human contribution. Impossible. The climate change theory is unfalsifiable pseudoscience at best, or more obviously, straight-out lies. The Great Barrier Reef. Once again, just like any other geological catastrophic event that happens anywhere in the world, the blame for the apparent demise of the Great Barrier Reef has been laid squarely at the feet of anthropogenic global warming to bolster and authenticate a stronger case for climate change. There are many variables that cause bleaching of coral, and unfortunately when it occurs, it can affect large areas at a time, with the worst occurring mainly in the north. Bleached coral is not dead and can rejuvenate itself quickly, sometimes within weeks if those bleaching conditions do not exist for too long. The main cause is warm weather, and there are a number of ways the water can be warmed, which are not attributed to the farce of global warming. These include cloudless skies with prolonged exposure to sunlight, no cooling sea breezes and shallow water. These conditions can occur in any summer or during weak monsoons that have long periods of clear skies, but are most common during El Nino events. So given that humans or CO2 have no influence over clouds, wind or the depth of the sea, it is impossible to assert that human activity has any influence on reef bleaching. Any idea that bleaching is a problem that has suddenly befallen the reef since CO2 levels have risen is dubious at best, since the Great Barrier Reef has only been closely monitored since the beginning of the 1990s. The first reports of bleaching were recorded in 1927 and again during the 1950s. There was no concern then, and no one bothered to look and see how bad it was. Despite the lack of historical data, there is a paper that was released in 2018 with research that shows bleaching has been a common occurrence for the previous 400 years. Reconstructing 4 centuries of temperature-induced coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, Nicholas Kaminos and Sebastian Henige. Quote, "Here, we use linear extensions from 44 overlapping Great Barrier Reef coral cores to extend the observational bleaching record by reconstructing temperature-induced bleaching patterns over 381 years spanning 1620 to 2001. Corals exhibited variable bleaching patterns, with bleaching frequency, number of bleaching years per decade, increasing 1620 to 1753, decreasing 1754 to 1820, and increasing 1821 to 2001 again. Bleaching prevalence, the proportion of cores exhibiting bleaching, fell 1670-1774 before increasing by 10% since the late 1790s, concurrent with positive temperature anomalies, placing recently observed increases in Great Barrier Reef coral bleaching into a wider context." Unquote. It is worth noting, however, that the same corals grow in much warmer waters in Papua New Guinea with no problems. Perhaps like many other life forms, the Great Barrier Reef is evolving through natural selection by merely adapting to a new environment, and that when the coral does die, even across vast areas, it soon repopulates with new life and begins to look healthy again, in some cases within weeks and months. Over the years, the reef has expanded in size and has also massively reduced, which again would make this phenomena natural. To back all this up, Professor Peter Ridd, marine physicist and senior lecturer at James Cook University in Townsville, Australia, who has been studying the Great Barrier Reef for over 30 years, vehemently disagrees that it is dying because of climate change. He has this to say about the reef.
Is the Great Barrier Reef dying?
No, look, the reef is in
fantastic shape. I often say that of all the ecosystems in the world, possibly with the exception of Antarctica, the Great Barrier Reef is one of the best preserved there is.
But Peter's main concern is the lack of quality assurance and accuracy over the science coming from mainstream scientific organisations in relation to the health and longevity of the reef.
The basic problem is that we can no longer trust the scientific organisations like the Australian Institute of Marine Science, even things like the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. A lot of this stuff is coming out, which the science is coming out not properly checked, tested or replicated. And this is a great shame because we really need to be able to trust our scientific institutions. And the fact is I do not think we can anymore. I think that most of the scientists who are pushing out this stuff, they genuinely believe that there are problems with the reef. I just don't think they're very objective about the science they do. I think they're emotionally attached to their subject,
but isn't
and
science,
you can't blame them. The reef is a beautiful thing.
Isn't a scientist supposed to have always a degree of scepticism, so he's checking and checking and rechecking rather than presenting stuff as empirical proof?
In an attempt to gag Ridd, James Cook University did its best to stifle his dissenting views, but Ridd insisted that he had the right to the academic freedom of speech and a right to be sceptical in order to encourage debate on the issues surrounding the health of the reef. Eventually, against all scientific principles, the university sacked him. Ridd sued for wrongful dismissal and was successful, being awarded over $1 million in damages, only to have the university appeal in order to try and salvage its damaged reputation. As of March 2020, that hearing has not yet taken place. These extraordinary lengths to stifle the truth is typical of the lengths government organisations will take to force their narrative on climate change rather than debate the issues and prove their science in accordance with the scientific method. Carbon tax. First, it must be understood that CO2 is not a poison, nor is it a pollutant, but it is essential for photosynthesis and is plant food. Life on Earth depends on it. More of it means that plants and crops will grow quicker, making agriculture and its dependents more prosperous. A larger abundance of bigger plants also mean more CO2 is converted to give us more oxygen. The commercial greenhouse industry raises the levels of CO2 in their greenhouses from 400 parts per million up to 1500 parts per million. This is over 3 times the Earth's atmosphere and increases crop yields up to 30%. This level of concentration is perfectly safe for human exposure.
ARGA is driving growth in the agricultural sector by adding carbon dioxide to increase production capacity and guarantee large, attractive flowers and vegetables such as cucumbers, tomatoes and lettuce. Using carbon dioxide fertilization increases yield by up to 30%.
More CO2 can only benefit us all, especially since, as shown previously, it does not cause temperature to rise. Given that CO2 is essential to life, it is hard to determine why global governments would want to lower atmospheric levels and tax it. The reason can only be the promise of big bucks to the new markets it can yield, and is justified through the huge guilt trip laid at the feet of humans by politically motivated alarmist environmental organizations. Emissions trading schemes, or the proposed US version of carbon tax, the cap and trade scheme, are, in reality, at the center and sit quietly behind the whole climate change debate, and it is very murky indeed. The following gives a basic understanding of how these schemes work. Despite the futility of them, they are heavily corrupted by big business and fraudulently sanctioned by the bare-faced narrative from the IPCC, with lies even they themselves know are unbelievable. Carbon trading or cap and trade schemes are essentially schemes that create financial incentives for countries and organisations to reduce CO2 emissions. The administrative bodies such as the EU or Kyoto Protocol issues emissions credits, i.e. 1 tonne of CO2 equals 1 credit, based on an estimate of what the country, and in turn companies within it, would emit over a specified period of time. If the country through the companies manage to emit less than their cap, then they can either sell or save their remaining credits. If they exceed their limits of CO2 targets, then they must buy more or offset emissions, which allows them to emit more emissions. All face heavy fines, which is the incentive to reduce emissions. Thus, the right to pollute or emit greenhouse gases becomes a commodity that can be bought or sold at a market. Offsetting emissions does not reduce overall global emissions, but it does allow some companies to make profit without reducing emissions with no penalty. Carbon emission schemes, while they are well-intentioned, though needless, unfortunately have been hijacked by unscrupulous big business the world over, and their skullduggery has made these schemes totally ineffective. Some of the problems which make it ineffective include exclusion of major polluters, inaccurate emissions measurements, fraudulent outside offsets that allowed big polluters to buy cheap offset credits from abroad, program manipulation, over-allocation of emission allowances based on inaccurate measurements, price volatility, and billions of dollars in undeserved profits causing inflation of the markets. At times, the value of the permits dropped so low there was no penalty to polluters and therefore no incentive to reduce. The hypocritical Al Gore would be at the top of that list of unscrupulous big business. According to a report compiled from public record requests and information from the National Electric Service, Gore's 20-room, 10,070 square foot colonial-style mansion consumed an average of 19,241 kilowatt hours per month, more than 21.3 times that of the average US household of 901 kilowatt hours monthly. In September 2016 alone, Gore's home consumed 30,993 kilowatts, as much energy as a typical American family uses in 34 months. In the 12-month period from August 2016 through the end of July 2017, Gore burned through 230,889 kilowatts of electricity, including 66,159 kilowatts just to heat his swimming pool. The latter alone is enough, the report says, to power 6 average US households for a year. Gore obviously cannot deny this, but justifies himself by paying for carbon credits to a company which he is the chairman and part owner. So the former vice president is still living the life of Riley at his Nashville, Tennessee estate, while warning of the dire consequences if the rest of us don't urgently haul back our energy consumption. Gore has not made those same sacrifices himself. New Zealand is no stranger to the shenanigans in the corporate world either, and became the leading purchaser of fraudulent cheap hot air emissions reduction units, or ERUs, with which they use to offset their own emissions, having not actually made any reductions at all themselves. In brief, these units, ERUs, actually began life as AAUs, which are assigned amount units given to participating countries by the United Nations under the Kyoto process, which equaled their estimated emissions cap for the 2008 to 2012 commitment period. As a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian and Ukraine emissions were drastically overestimated, which gave them a huge surplus of 12 billion units. Trading of AAUs under the NZ was not allowed, so for compliance companies converted them to ERUs, which could be traded because they are supposed to represent reductions made by the selling country or company. In other words, if a country can't meet its reductions cap, then they must pay another country to do so instead. The then national government was fully aware of this situation, but continued to allow trading of hot air ERUs for as long as the international community would allow. And knowing full well that these units did not represent any real reductions, they still counted the fraudulent carbon credits towards New Zealand's emission obligations, offsetted to meet our commitment under the Kyoto Agreement through to 2020. Clearly, the Russian carbon units did not represent any reduction, as the surplus was flicked off for as little as 17 cents each, undermining and causing the collapse of several ETSs around the world. This situation shows that the government and companies such as BP Energy Asia, New Zealand Forest Leasing Limited, Z Energy, Waidakai Pastoral Limited, a state-owned enterprise that converted vast tracts of land to dairy, and New Zealand Steel Limited clearly do not give one care about the environment nor the perceived CO2 problem. Whether or not that perception is one of outward concern, if not private disbelief, of climate change. But worse is that the target of reducing emissions to 1990 levels for the committed period of 2008 to 2012 under Kyoto have failed miserably. As at 2015, New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions were 24% higher than 1990. 80.2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emitted compared to 1990's 66.4 million tonnes, a distant reality from the Paris Agreement of 5% reduction to 2020. It seems though that perhaps even the politicians could see future problems with the bottom line and discontinued support to Kyoto, opting out of the second 2015 to 2020 commitment period, which, in reading between the lines, there seems no other reason than the realization that it was going to cost New Zealand millions. This excerpt from the Morgan Foundation report on the New Zealand ETSs, Climate Cheats, shows the real underlying attitude of politicians in New Zealand towards climate change. There would be one very significant development before 2012. At the UN Climate Summit in Doha in December, the government announced that New Zealand would not commit to the Kyoto Protocol's second commitment period. Instead, our 2020 target would be voluntary rather than legally binding, with expected aims to cut emissions by 10 to 20% through to 2020. In response, countries voted to shut New Zealand off from using any Kyoto offset credits in Commitment Period 2 if we weren't in. This punishment took the government, who had been thinking we could have had our cake and eat it too, by surprise. What it meant was that the door for New Zealand to buy foreign credits would now close in mid-2015, at the end of the true-up period when credits from Commitment Period 1 could still be traded. This in reality seems to show that climate change to politicians is all about politics and money, nothing more, nothing less, and worst of all, it's going to cost us billions for which we will get absolutely nothing in return.
NewsHub can reveal the cost to the New Zealand economy to meet our Paris Agreement targets will be $1 billion every year for a decade. But that money won't be spent on reducing domestic emissions. We'll be paying other countries to reduce theirs for us. Isabel Ewing reports.
By signing the Paris Agreement, New Zealand has pledged to cut our domestic emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But information released to Newshub shows in order to do that, we'll need to buy credits from other countries who cut their pollution.
It's a hard problem because there aren't a lot of incentives to do it domestically.
A briefing to Judith Collins on her first day as Energy Minister revealed the cost of buying international carbon units to offset our own emissions will be $14.2 billion over 10 years. That's $1.4 billion per year. Under the emission trading scheme, costs are met by businesses who use carbon and the government.
More recently, here is Mike Hoskins' view on the current plan being advanced by the Greens, which is even more ridiculous and unachievable than the 2008-2012 committed period.
G'day there, James Shaw has reached into his nutty jar and pulled out another doozy to end the week. He started the week off, of course, with his plan that we all eat less meat, the very thing that we make a living out of. He ends with his much vaunted zero emissions bill. He's tabled some options and so begins a 6-week consultation process. I'll start, shall I? You're mad and it's not going to happen. End of submission. And here's why it isn't going to happen. One, it's trying to match some of the fabulously insane ideas already signed up to by other countries. This is part of an international try to look good competition. The UK 80% reduction of emissions, Canada 80%, the EU 80 to 95%. We need to be seen to be doing the same thing. And when I say doing, no one's doing, they're just saying they're doing. It's like Britain banning combustion engines. It's never going to happen. Two, the reason it won't happen is that it will tip our economy on its head. Now, that's not me saying that. That's an admission in the papers. GDP will slow. Household income will slow. And, you ready for this? Those least able to absorb it will be hit hardest. Thus, you will need more government support to help those through the change. So, in other words, we aren't growing. Our incomes aren't growing, and yet we still need to pay more to help those most affected. What politician is taking that to an election? What politician is successfully going to sell a stalling economy with underperforming household income, all so we can save the world? And three, and this is perhaps the most critical part before we even get to perhaps 1 and 2, James doesn't have buy-in. Do people believe broadly in climate change? Well, perhaps they do. Would they do without a straw or a single-use plastic bag? Of course they would. Would they watch their life savings vanish? No. Oh, there's more. Our transport fleet would need to be 95% electric. How's that going to happen? It isn't. Why? Because we don't produce enough power. Not without building some more dams. I assume he'd go hydro, not coal. Is James lining up to build some more dams, block some rivers, destroy some countryside? I don't think so. And all of this by 2050, 30 short years away. This is a sham. It is a fraud. It's a well-intentioned fraud. James and co mean well, but he's got no buy-in, and he will get no buy-in because the simple truth is people like money and they like a job. And under his scheme, it's possible they won't have one, or if they do, it won't be worth having at all. We live in a country of trees too, by the way. That's the other thing. 10% of the country is going to be in trees. A country of trees and broke people. J.R.R. Tolkien would have been proud of a fantasy this fantastic.
No matter which camp one sits in this debate, this is a woeful mismanagement of public funds, and it is only fortunate, given that so far measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have failed significantly, that those measures are not required anyway. This money would do more good spent locally on cleaning up our waterways or the eradication of pests, which do far more damage than climate change, reducing plastics, planting more trees, or perhaps even aiding the nation's homeless. Conclusion. It is safe to say that CO2 is not a pollutant and could not be labelled that even if it were 2 or 3 times greater than the current levels in our atmosphere now. But worse, there are many more toxins we are releasing into our environment, both air and land, that should take precedent and are much more worthy of demonising. So, while learning to be environmentally conscientious, it is important that our attentions are focused on the real dangers, and tragically the promotion of climate change through bad science under the guise of saving our planet is not only irresponsible, but rather a Machiavellian diversion and a total waste of time and resources. The biggest tragedy is the brainwashing of our youth, who are getting this fraudulent science pumped into them in schools, with those lies being further reinforced by the likes of Greta Thunberg, who is innocently spreading this adult propaganda with unabashed conviction. But of course, she simply does not know any better. But for anyone undecided on the issue, it can be difficult to take a position with so much conflicting information available. For every video clip on the net that is pro-climate change, there are just as many to counter them. Although, with Google's readjusted search algorithms, the skeptic view is becoming harder to find. It seems Google does not allow freedom of speech. Together with all the publicity over this pending doom that global warming predicts, there are a couple of smoking guns to the negative that one should consider before deciding one way or the other, that whether or not climate change is real, human-caused, and dangerous. Without doubt, these smoking guns expose many of the lies and therefore invalidate climate change as a theory. And these are the ClimateGate cover-up, including, and as well as, the non-release of climate data from scientists who are trying to convince the world we are all going to die if we don't stop using fossil fuels right now. There have been many instances where scientists whose research have been questioned and where subsequent requests of their working data has been denied or become lost, among many other excuses. This leads to serious doubt over the validity of the research, especially since some of the claims overthrow past well-established research. Surely, any scientist who believes in his own research and who has cast doubt over the other theories would be only too willing to prove it by having their research validated with peer review, especially by a skeptic. Non-disclosure can only mean that the research and the conclusions these ClimateGatists have reached can only be wrong. That fake science is clearly illustrated here with this ClimateGate email from Phil Jones to Warwick Hughes, denying Hughes access to publicly funded research data. Quote, "I should warn you that some data we have we are not supposed to pass on to others. We can pass on the gridded data, which we do. Even if WMO agrees, I will still not pass on the data. We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" Unquote. Another email explains the reason for the change of names from global warming to climate change. Things were going well for the warmists' theory, especially up until 1998, as temperatures were rising exponentially. But since then, they have not. This is another of the emails leaked from the Climate Research Unit. The 2004 email from the Mins Tyndall Centre on the UEA campus said, quote, "In my experience, global warming, freezing, is already a bit of a public relations problem with the media." Unquote. To which Swedish chief climate negotiator Bo Jelen replied, quote, "I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labelling than global warming." Unquote. So instead of finding observable verified evidence to prove their theory, they have changed the theory to fit the evidence. Sir Karl Popper, a scientific philosopher, defined the scientific process by distinguishing the scientific from the unscientific, the latter labelled as pseudoscience. Popper said, quote, "A theory that explains everything explains nothing, as James Corbett of the Corbett Report explains here."
One of the giants in the history of the philosophy of science, Karl Popper, once famously observed that a theory that explains everything explains nothing. And to be sure, the theory of catastrophic anthropogenic climate change appears to explain everything. After all, we all know that climate change makes for shorter winters, except for when it makes for harsher winters, and climate change means less snow except for when climate change means more snow. And climate change causes droughts in California and floods in Texas and Oklahoma, and generally makes wet places wetter and dry places drier, except when it makes wet places drier and dry places wetter. And climate change causes more hurricanes at the same time as it causes less hurricanes. Climate change causes more rain but less water, and less rain but more water. Climate change decreases the spread of malaria at the same time as it increases the spread of malaria, but don't worry, the Terminator himself advises us not to listen to those climate change cynics. Hey guys? Do I need to go on? Oh, okay. Climate change makes San Francisco foggier. Climate change makes San Francisco less foggy. Climate change causes duller autumn leaves. Climate change causes more colorful autumn leaves. Climate change makes for less salty seas. Climate change makes for saltier seas. Climate change causes the polar ice caps to melt. Climate change causes the polar ice caps to freeze. Climate change makes the Earth hotter, unless the Earth isn't getting hotter, in which case climate change can explain that too. What's the problem here? This sounds like the perfect scientific theory. It can explain literally everything, including self-contradictory things.
Other smoking guns point to the blatant manipulation of temperature data, which inevitably reflects a cooler past, with more recent temperatures adjusted up to show a much more dramatic warming trend, which, even if true, is no problem, as temperatures have been much hotter in the past anyway. Politicians seem to be blind to the fact that the results from climate models from which they are making decisions are always wrong, not just a bit, but a lot. They are all seeing what they have to see, lest they face losing their jobs. Most glaringly, for the past 2 decades, CO2 levels have risen from approximately 200 to 400 parts per million, which are nowhere near levels that would be dangerous. This has had no effect whatsoever on global temperature, which, as shown, has flatlined or decreased a little over the past decade. Any graphs that show otherwise have been needlessly adjusted and always show increases with location and altitude corrections that are exaggerated, making the data even more inaccurate when it was in its raw form. But there is a positive spin-off with all this extra CO2, which has resulted in a much greener Earth. A 2016 NASA study shows that, quote, a quarter to half of Earth's vegetated land has shown significant greening over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, according to a new study published in the journal Nature Climate Change on April the 25th. So obviously all this extra CO2 must be good for us all, yes? But no. The senseless international push to reduce it continues to gather momentum. The blind continue to lead the blind. Global governments insist that the emperor is wearing new clothes, and these double-speaking planetary saviors, some well-meaning but ignorant, together with oil companies, continue to try and convince the world they are really serious about reducing CO2 emissions.
BP is now pledging to reach net zero emissions by 2050. It's part of a plan by the company's new CEO, Bernard Looney, to transform the legacy of the oil giant. Details are limited right now, but the company's aim is to cut greenhouse gas emissions from its global operations and emissions from the oil and gas it produces by the year 2050. And during that time frame, BP also plans to cut the carbon intensity of the product that it sells in half. These commitments are the most ambitious from any major oil company to date.
In the meantime, ExxonMobil, the largest oil and gas producer in the United States, met with Wall Street yesterday at the company's annual investor day at the NYSE. Following that, I spoke to Exxon's chief executive, Darren Woods. We hit on a number of topics, things like the company's plans to try and combat global economic slowing because of the coronavirus, and about appealing to younger investors, some of whom are less than excited about fossil fuels.
As people hear about what we're trying to do to meet the growing needs of society all around the world, the fact that energy is required to lift people out of poverty and to grow economies, and that oil and gas is an important part of that mix and will be as the world strives to transition to less carbon-intensive forms of energy, that we still have a very important role to play.
You've also rolled out your goals in terms of climate change and trying to cut emissions.
We have been advocating broadly to keep methane regulations in place.
Rex Tillerson, your predecessor, former Secretary of State, was speaking recently somewhere in Texas, I should say, and he said something about how he's not sure that what humans can really do to try and combat climate change. Do you agree with that, or would you argue the other side?
Well, I think, and Rex was working on this when he was at the company, and we continue to work on that. We step back and look at, first of all, we're in the business of meeting society's needs. Redesign manufacturing processes to take energy and heat out of those, which then reduces the amount of greenhouse gases. But it will require a technology advancement and breakthrough to ultimately get to the stage where we can reach society's aspiration of eliminating CO2 emissions.
But all this is just PR talk that leads to little or no action. Clearly, governments and oil companies, along with their hanger-on minions, while fake concern, are clearly not serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. According to the IPCC, climate change caused by human emissions is real and dangerous. The science is settled. We have a global climate emergency. If so, surely the governments of the world would be more serious about remedies, even the stupidity of CO2 reductions. Yet they continue to sit on their hands because there is an unspoken truth that no politician dare utter, a deep undercurrent of certainty that collectively lays in the minds of most of our spineless leaders, which is that the whole theory is a crock.
An issue that is gaining more mainstream attention than ever before, climate change and what we should be doing about it. New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions increased by nearly 20% over 16 years. It's just gone through the roof, basically. Students are marching to demand stronger action, and councils are declaring climate emergencies, states of emergency, a bit over the top. This week, many media organisations, including News Hub, are covering Climate Now Week in the lead-up to the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Joining us now is climate scientist James Renbrook. James, g'day. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to have you on the program. I'm not sure we're doing enough. We've got these lofty goals and there's some massive emergencies out there, but what are we doing?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there is a lot of talk and declaring emergencies, all that good stuff, but actual emissions are still going up, so we're not tackling the real problem. I'd have to say, though, it's great that the talk has changed in the last year or so. There are councils, governments declaring emergencies, people marching in the street, and I think we have to have that step before we do get to the action, but we need the action right now.
So if you declare an emergency, you do something about it. So if I was to declare an emergency in my house, there might be water coming out of the sun or whatever, you then go and put it in the stock banks or you do something. So we've got these states of emergencies with these councils and not a dollar put to their name. There's no budget to these things, there's no plan, it's just a state of emergency. It's a joke.
I wouldn't say it's a joke.
But even more alarming is that any of the pointless measures needed to make such ridiculous reductions and pacify the jihadi-type climate change campaigners would certainly lead to a nation's economic ruin. And as part of the global flock of sheep, the New Zealand government blindly and timidly follows the alarmist rhetoric just to be with the in crowd, which has resonated in the implementation of that cosy, fuzzy, feel-good emissions trading scheme. This legislation includes provisions which so far, and unsurprisingly, have failed to inspire reductions that even come close to present reduction targets. Further proof that the beehive is frightened of the economic repercussions, or more likely, its sycophantic inhabitants don't give a shit. But of course, even though these targets are desirable, any reductions of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions will have little or no effect on atmospheric levels, now or in the future. Beneath all the hype over failed green sustainable energy sources, which are mainly solar and wind, and if world governments really want a solution to this fabricated problem, then they need to look no further than the numerous suppressed technologies that, if investigated further, could replace fossil fuels as energy alternatives for industry, transportation, and domestic needs very quickly. Instead of protesting against the lack of action, climate alarmists would be better off advocating for the release of these suppressed free energy technologies. This will kill two birds with one stone, in that almost no human fabricated greenhouse gas emissions will be emitted to the atmosphere. And more importantly, there will be little to no cost to heat homes, run cars, and cook food, which can only be good for the world populace, especially third world countries. Unfortunately, these technologies are mostly suppressed or shunned for two main reasons, and usually by either the military or big oil. The military fear the weaponization of it, and the oil companies can't make money from it. Some of these numerous technologies include perpetual motion technologies, also known as over-unity devices, devices producing more energy than is input, with research centering around electromagnetics and antigravitics, to the point where free energy could be provided to the world with an initial cost, but free thereafter.
In the backwoods of Mississippi, a mile down this dirt road, past the keep out and no trespassing signs, is the workshop of Joe Newman, a brilliant, self-educated inventor who says he has developed a machine that could solve the energy crisis.
He says that his energy machine could power every American home, farm, business, automobile, and appliance with electricity at a fraction of the present cost. More than 30 scientists and technicians have tested the energy machine, and they agree it works.
But there's a major stumbling block in getting this device to the public. The inventor can't let private industry have the machine until the patent is granted, but obtaining the patent seems to be almost impossible. So in little less than a year, the U.S. Patent Office has told the man who just may have an amazing machine, number one, they didn't want to talk with him. Number two, they will never give him a patent. Number three, the invention has a hidden energy device. Number four, there is no hidden energy device. Your invention works, but your description of the invention is inadequate. And finally, your description is adequate. Your invention does not work. And now 31 people with scientific backgrounds have signed legal documents swearing to the machine's validity.
Cold fusion. It is controversial, but it is real and it works.
20 years ago, it appeared for a moment that all of our energy problems could be solved. It was the announcement of cold fusion, nuclear energy like that which powers the sun, but at room temperature on a tabletop. It promised to be cheap, limitless, and clean. Cold fusion would end our dependence on the Middle East and stop those greenhouse gases blamed for global warming. It would change everything. But then, just as quickly as it was announced, it was discredited so thoroughly that cold fusion became a catchphrase for junk science. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to oblivion. For many scientists today, cold fusion is hot again.
We can wield the power of nuclear physics on a tabletop. The potential is unlimited. That is the most powerful energy source known to man.
Michael McCubry says he has seen that energy more than 50 times in cold fusion experiments he's doing at SRI International, a respected California lab that does extensive work for the government.
Thorium reactors, an alternative source of nuclear power that is safe both with its mechanism and waste byproduct.
We are counting down our takes for the top 5 reasons your future is powered by thorium. 5. It can be placed wherever. It is walk-away safe and doesn't have any requirements regarding location. 4. It supplies power whenever. It runs 24 hours per day, all 365 days of the year, and even automatically adapts to changes in demand. 3. It's clean. It produces neither air pollution nor any greenhouse gases like CO2. 2. It's cheap. It produces energy cheaper than any other, even coal and gas. This makes it globally scalable on market conditions, without government subsidies or interventions. 1. It will last forever. There is plenty of thorium, and it is found in high concentrations on all continents. It is so easy to find that we have even mapped it on the Moon and Mars.
We will never run out.
Water fuel combustion engines, which run on hydrogen with a device that separates the hydrogen from the oxygen in water. It is no secret that inventions to convert motor vehicles to run on hydrogen are numerous worldwide. The patents and blueprints to which are often owned by oil companies who, for obvious reason, have them locked away forever. Despite this, some automobile companies are beginning to explore this technology. Patents for water-powered car engines have been popping up around the world since the 1920s, and there are 3 New Zealanders alone who have invented cars that run on water. Archie Blue, Malcolm Vincent and Dylan Whitford all have failed to bring their inventions to the world. Christchurch man Archie Blue patented his version of the water car in 1978, and he demonstrated it to a number of influential people who were satisfied that it worked. He received numerous generous offers which he turned down, but despite this, Archie failed to get backers for further development from around the world. Archie died in the early 90s, an old man, and all his research was apparently dumped at the tip by his family. Malcolm Vincent from Nelson also claimed he had perfected a car that would run on hydrogen, but his demonstrations mostly failed. He did, however, accept a $1 million offer and signed a dubious contract that never came to anything despite receiving checks which all bounced. At the age of 34, in mysterious circumstances, Vincent was found dead inside a hay baler he had been operating alone, fueling widespread rumour that his death was to silence him and to suppress his invention. In 1994, 18-year-old Wanganui man Dylan Whitford, who had also invented a water car, was found almost beaten to death and was hospitalised to ICU after the local newspaper had run a story about him. The day before the beating, that reporter received a threatening call directed at Whitford. The caller suggested Mr. Whitford should be careful, reminding him that a Nelson man, who knew of the technology, died in mysterious circumstances involving a hay baler. Whitford, in fear of his life, to move overseas to continue his experiments. More on these men can be found in these books, Suppressed Inventions and Other Discoveries by Jonathan Eisen, and The Water Engine by Aries van Jaag. And this documentary, Secret New Zealand, Oil and Water Don't Mix, Hydrogen-Powered Car. Backyard tinkerers are often responsible for these inventions, but who lack funds to develop their technologies further. They are often brought out by big oil. But for those who are not happy to sell, those who want to bring their inventions to the world, often wind up being marginalized as nutters, destroyed financially, and in some cases meeting death in circumstances otherwise dubious. One of the biggest problems associated with the misinformation about the climate issue is the refusal of mainstream media to present both sides of the debate. As a result, communities are bombarded with climate emergency PR and spin coerced by sycophantic politics that ignores the truth. John Campbell explains this perfectly here when recently referring to the riots in Hong Kong.
Internationally renowned China expert Professor Anne-Marie Brady about the massive protests in Hong Kong. I asked her if people in mainland China would know what was going on. Would state-run media outlets be reporting it? Not only was Professor Brady's answer to that no, she pointed out that Chinese language media in New Zealand weren't all reporting what was happening in Hong Kong.
To newsrooms here in New Zealand of Chinese publications for New Zealand, just for stories, and the journalists talk about it as if it's just a very kind of commonplace thing, and that was a real penny drop moment for me, realising that journalists don't behave necessarily the same as...
They explicitly follow the party line.
They have to.
And they have to.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And they talk about it kind of like a little bit eye-rolling.
Yeah.
But amazing. It's the rules they have to follow. So, yeah, it was really interesting.
And so is that...
As previously shown, during the 70s, scientific thought on climate change was that we were heading for an ice age of biblical proportions, and the world would be frozen over by the year 2000. They were wrong then, and they are wrong now. This is a list of some of the published papers on the Calling hypothesis back then. When all's said and done, there is one absolute fact with regard to the Earth's climate, and that is that science has no clear idea how it works. There are simply so many variables that control it, which makes accurate prediction practically impossible. And the proposition that we could control the climate by adding or reducing CO2 is an absolute fantasy, and any implementation of such would be akin to pushing excrement up a very steep hill. If scientists are looking for any reasons why the Earth is warming so drastically, if in reality it actually is, then they need to look no further than the Sun, the main contributor to the Earth's climate, which is particularly responsive to solar flares. It is the Sun, nothing less, nothing more. And if we had a volume knob for that, problem solved. So finally, here is a prediction from the makers of this film. Over the next few years and into eternity, the temperature may rise a little. If it doesn't, it will flatline or go down instead. It may rise very high or drop very low, just like it has done since the beginning of time. And there is nothing mankind can do about it. Our climate is in the hands of Mother Nature, where it will always stay. But, as the climate change theory stands now, there are too many of its followers pretending to be asleep. Sadly, they can never be woken up.
I thank the chairman and the committee for the opportunity to offer testimony on this important topic. Prior to 2010, I felt that supporting the IPCC consensus on human-caused climate change was the responsible thing to do. That all changed for me in November 2009, following the leaked ClimateGate emails that illustrated the sausage-making and even bullying that went into building that consensus. I came to the growing realization that I had fallen into the trap of groupthink in supporting the IPCC consensus. I began making an independent assessment of topics in climate science that had the most relevance to policy. I concluded that the high confidence of the IPCC's conclusions were not justified, and that there were substantial uncertainties in our understanding of how the climate system works. I realized that the premature consensus on human-caused climate change was harming scientific progress because of the questions that don't get asked and the investigations that aren't made. As a result of my analyses that challenged the IPCC consensus, I have been publicly called a serial climate disinformer, anti-science, and a denier by a prominent climate scientist. A scientist's job is to continually challenge their own biases and ask, how could I be wrong? Scientists who demonize their opponents are behaving in a way that is antithetical to the scientific process. These are the tactics of enforcing a premature theory for political purpose. There is enormous pressure for climate scientists to conform to the so-called consensus. This pressure comes from federal funding agencies, universities, and professional societies and scientists themselves. Reinforcing this consensus are strong monetary, reputational, and authority interests. Owing to these pressures and the gutter tactics of the academic debate on climate change, I recently resigned my tenured faculty position at Georgia Tech.